the causes of close calls and harm events and make just decisions without promoting intimidating behavior, bullying, people having it come back on them once they reported. And if you give people information about how you're using those reports, you're going to enforce that. So I want to spend a few minutes on what we call the trust report and prove dynamic. This is something that we adapted from the work of James Reason and Alan Hobbs. The citation is there for you on the screen. It sounds like a dry kind of read, but it's actually, of all of James Reason's books, it's one of my favorite. He's a psychologist out of the UK who is spending more and more of his time on high reliability in healthcare. So it's a dynamic cycle. It illustrates a series of self-reinforcing activities where if staff trust that you're going to do something with the information they share with you, you then take those reports that they give you and you improve upon it. And then to close that loop, you let staff know what happened with that report. And maybe it's something that you can't tackle right now. Maybe it's something that is a big budget item, or it's a system issue you've been really trying to work on. But you have to tell them what you're going to do or what you did with it. And why is that? That's what creates a learning culture. So the trust piece, again, you are separating culpable acts from errors, and you're eliminating intimidating behaviors to get people to report those unsafe conditions and close calls. And then you're improving and learning from and strengthening your systems. And that's how you create a learning culture. Sounds easy, right? Yes? No, I'm getting shakes no. You're correct. It's not as easy as it looks on paper. Here are some of the challenges with it. Challenge number 1, leadership has to be visible and walking the talk on trust. If you have staff that have persistently displayed intimidating behaviors and nothing seems to change, that's a problem. The leadership team has to be walking the talk that says there is zero tolerance for disruptive or intimidating behavior, especially if somebody is reporting a concern. It's probably a system issue, and to have this person have it come back on them is not appropriate. Number 2, what I just brought up, the intimidating and bullying behaviors. Those are the things that make it hard for people to report their concerns, especially if they work in a tight team, such as in an OR, where the report comes out, you have to ask the people about what happened. Somebody's going to figure out who reported it. It shouldn't matter. The whole team could report as one. It is the kind of environment you want. Challenge 3 is identifying and reporting those risks. We aren't taught what risks are in our professional schools. We aren't taught how to look at something and understand this is risky. Why are we doing it this way? I remember in the early part of my career, my background is in pediatrics, and I'm going to age myself by telling you this, but our treatment for diaper rash in the peds unit back in the day was a heat lamp, right? I am horrified to think about the use of this these days. We did have a yardstick to measure the safe distance away of the baby, but that's how we treated the diaper rash back then. That was a huge risk. This was in the 1990s, and we didn't understand risk because all of the publications about patient safety didn't start to come out until the IOM report in 1999. So identifying and reporting risks, you cannot assume that your staff know what you want to hear about. And finally, challenge 4 is learning from those errors and sharing it with staff. No matter how you choose to do the learning and the sharing, you need to do it. It's the most important takeaway I want you to have from this talk today. So what is stopping people from reporting? Plainly, punishing people for making mistakes. You see on this continuum that mistakes, errors, and problems are at one end, blameworthy acts are at another, but both of those categories generate harm events, close calls, and unsafe conditions. So you're not likely to be able to figure out which came from which end of the spectrum without doing a fairly deep analysis of what went on. The thing that generated it, though, is going to make it easier or harder. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a minute. So who's heard of a just culture algorithm? Many people in the course. Okay, so the generic term for a just culture algorithm is an objective accountability evaluation or an objective accountability assessment tool. I've been in nursing long enough to remember the days when you reported, you got fired or you got written up. And then this pendulum swung, and in the 2000s, we were talking about a blame-free culture. Pendulum swung too far the other way. There are situations, thank God not frequent, where somebody is performing in a reckless way, is making really poor choices. Most people don't get up and think, who can I hurt at work today? But sometimes when people feel performance pressure, production pressure, they make choices to dispense with some of the necessary steps. A conscious decision knowing it could harm a patient is a blameworthy act. So the true safety culture balances those. And the assessment or evaluation tools I'm talking about helps you figure out errors in a uniform way so that everybody has the same kinds of standards upon them. It also works to eliminate intimidating behaviors. These are really small graphs. I want them up here just for illustration purposes. There is a link to some of these at the resource slides at the end. This is an incident decision tree that was generated by the work of James Reason. It was created by the National Patient Safety Agency in the UK. And while the National Patient Safety Agency no longer exists, you can get access to this on AHRQ's website. And the link to it is in the resources slide. What this basically does is it asks 4 questions, okay? The first question is, did the person intend the action that occurred? The second question is there some kind of evidence of impairment? Did the person come to work with a fever of 102? Is the person undergoing a divorce right now? Is the person got a substance abuse issue? Was there some kind of impairment? The third question is, did the individual depart from procedure, from policy and procedure? And the fourth question is, would you, as another person with the same training, have done the same actions as this person? And where that question comes into play is what is commonly called workarounds. I prefer the term performance variation. Because, not to be funny, although it is funny, because of the fact that if you as a nurse have your goals to meet for the day and you have a system set up that is going to prevent you from meeting those goals because it's complicated or because you can't get the help you need or because the equipment's missing, you have to make choices. And sometimes the choices end up in harm, and sometimes it end up in you reaching your goals, and maybe you came up with a better way to do something. So digging in and finding out what are the performance variations people feel that they have to use to meet their goals for the shift, that's the stuff you want to hear about. I have a friend who's a senior nursing executive. She works in a hospital, and when she does her leadership rounds, she'll go up to a nurse and she'll be like, "Hi, how's your day going?" And the person will respond to her, and she'll, talk with them a few minutes further. Maybe she'll ask her about the kids or, how's the new puppy, that kind of thing. And then she'll ask, "Tell me about your favorite workaround." And they do. And then they slap their hand over their mouth because they're not supposed to have workarounds. But they trust her so much that they do, and then they realize, oh my gosh. And then she'll thank them. She'll thank them, and it'll be the subject of a future staff meeting. It'll be a Vegas rules room, and they'll say, we want to talk about this particular issue. Are more than one person doing this? Okay, let's dig into why. What is preventing you from doing it the way we've laid it out? Well, this step and this step make no sense. They need to be reversed, or what have you. That's a conversation that can be generated by this kind of algorithm. This is the version that Montefiore Medical Center in New York City came up with. They started with their physicians using this tool. It's more of a 4x4 or 2x2 size box rather, where they do ask if the standard of care was met. And if it wasn't, they ask about, do you think other competent associates with the same level of training would have done the same thing? And then it's just yes or no answers. And then, what are impaired practices? Again, it's a blurry copy of it. I can't seem to get a cleaner copy of it. But if you go on Montefiore's Medical Center's website, you should be able to find it. And then finally, the one that's probably most familiar to people is the one that's called the Just Culture Algorithm, TM, by the company Outcome Ingenuity, started by David Marks, who's an attorney. And he wrote books about this kind of practice. which explain a somewhat complicated algorithm, but it's basically asking the 4 questions, and it tells you what you need to do. So who is using one of these in their organization? Any of them? Okay, we've got some hands. Just shout out, if you will. How do you know that it's being used equitably throughout the organization? How do you audit its usage? Does anybody do that? Over here.
We have an employee opinion survey that assesses, do you feel like your mistakes are held against you?
So the employee opinion survey that says, are mistakes held against you? How do you know if the manager on Unit A and the manager on Unit B are using it in the exact same way for the exact same situation? Back here?
When we do things like root cause analysis or other types of analysis, like we have a weekly fall review, we bring that, and at the end of the review, we put it in front of all the leaders that are present. And so we really work to keep it active and make sure that it's being used and things like that.
So once you've done the root cause analysis, all the leaders will receive the details and then run through the algorithm to see that everybody lands at the same place. So those are good ideas. I'll tell you, implementing this is not nearly as hard as sustaining its use in a routine, similar fashion. We worked with a healthcare organization that knew it wasn't being used the same on unit to unit. We got a whole bunch of managers together in one room, and we asked them, write down your best understanding of how it's supposed to be used. Don't have to get it exactly right according to the policy, but just how is it supposed to be used? Write all that down. Broke them into teams. They put it all in a flip chart. Then we said, okay, write down how you're really using it. Another Vegas rules room. How do you really use it? And they would write down things like, well, I generally don't, or I'll do it in my office and I won't show it to the person I'm having to talk to about their error or mistake, to people who'd said, I absolutely go through it with the employee every single time I take it out to use it, to other folks who said, I have almost no training in how to have these difficult conversations with staff. All they told us was how to use the algorithm. They didn't tell us how to have that conversation. So if you're thinking about using something like this, there are a lot of things to think about, and following up on it is really important. There's a study done by Edwards. It was published in the 2018 American Journal of Medical Quality. And what he said was, more than half of the hospitals that adopted a Just Culture algorithm thought it had a positive effect, and it was associated with a better peer review process. But they could find no association in this study with objective measures of hospital performance. The use of the Just Culture algorithm had no association on non-punitive response to error. The question on the ARC survey that has been at less than 50% positive response for the entire history of the assessment. 2 things come to mind in my head from that. One is maybe we're not asking the right questions on these safety culture assessments. And 2, maybe the association is too weak to detect because of the way people use these algorithms. The final thing, though, is widespread adoption has not reduced people's reluctance to report. So it may be worth the effort, but you want to think about it really strongly about how you're going to audit its use and make sure it's uniform. And just to let you know, the entire purpose of that algorithm is to increase reporting. That's what it's meant to do. If people see that they're being treated fairly and equitably on the things that they report, they'll report more. Close calls probably happen at 300 times as frequently as harm events, and so they are much more information rich than an actual harm event. If you're pretty confident that you're finding out most of your harm events from reporting and not from litigation, so in other words, you don't hear about a harm event for the first time from an attorney. If you're confident you're hearing about most of those things, and you've got a good process for reacting to them, you want to start to shift your culture to proactive. You want to take those close calls and you want to learn from them, because there's 2 things about them that are wonderful. One is learn about the thing that stopped it from reaching the patient. What was that prevention system. Maybe it's just one person. Maybe if you analyze all the close calls on one unit for medication close calls, you find out there's 1 or 2 nurses that have a positively deviant way of preventing them. Learn from that. The second thing that's great about close calls is there's lots of them. So you have a much bigger pool to aggregate from. If you have a bunch of similar kinds of close calls, let's say medication errors, let's stick with that example, and you put them all together, can you see what day of the week most of them happen on? That's the simple power of aggregation. If you find out that most of your medication errors are happening on Wednesday between 3 and 7 p.m., what's going on Wednesdays between 3 and 7 p.m., right? If you look at your data, you're going to find some commonalities. Close calls as a group are going to include errors and mistakes and problems and violations and unsafe conditions all together. They're all going to be wrapped up in that. So what are errors and mistakes? Well, first of all, errors happen when most of the time you're doing some kind of automated response. Who's accidentally driven to work on their day off? I'm the only one? Really? Okay. Who has accidentally put the wrong thing in the refrigerator? You put your phone in the refrigerator? Okay, you've got more hands on that. And put the milk on the counter. Whatever it is that you're doing, you had a good plan, but you executed it wrong. Okay? That's what errors are. The consequences will vary according to what it is that you actually did. So again, these are largely automatic subroutines, things like scanning barcodes, giving medications, things that you're kind of doing without really thinking. Now, they differ from mistakes in that you had the wrong plan, but you executed it beautifully. Okay? These are much harder to detect because of the fact that they involve higher level processing in your brain, judging, reasoning, decision making. And you have to be able to reenact that sequence of events as the person who made that mistake, because you're not going to figure out what led you to that unless you think about it. So if you've got something where that action was wrong, the person just picked the wrong action completely, it really is worthy of spending some time sitting the person down, giving them a break, write down every thought process you had for this action so we can figure out where the issues are with this. Again, mistakes are not blameworthy. Somebody wasn't trying to come up with the worst plan on earth that day. It just happened. What about those problems? I call them everyday annoyances. I remember many of those days at work where I didn't have what I needed. My medications were late. I couldn't find the proper bed type for the child that I was going to be taking care of. All kinds of things that I just considered expected because healthcare has such a high degree of failure. So you can't do a task because something's not available when you need it, or you're distracted, or there's multiple staff trying to get to your patient at the same time. You've got lab waiting in the hall, you've got PT standing there, you've got the physician who wants to see the patient, and you've not even finished doing their admission assessment. All of these kinds of things build up together to create unsafe conditions. All of the things named here are unsafe conditions. Do you have staff that report this kind of thing? Does anybody see those kind of reports in your reporting system? Got some nods, okay. So clearly defining what kinds of issues you want to hear about is going to help staff recognize that what they consider business as usual, a daily annoyance, is actually a risky situation that you want to hear about and you want them to report. Okay, so we're going to go through this little vignette here. This nurse, who'd only been out of school for a few months, was sent to cover a child in the pediatric ICU who would be coming out to the nurse's regular unit later that day. Upon arrival, she gets report from the ICU nurse. The ICU nurse says, he's really easy. He's only got a few oral meds right now. There's one IV med, and he's going to be coming off his monitor and out to your floor later today. That's the plan. So she goes over the med list and the equipment, and then she leaves to take care of a critical patient. The nurse notified that there was medication due, so she went ahead and administered oral Lasix. And then she went to document it and realized that she had given the wrong medication, that the boy had gotten it just an hour earlier. Realizing that this could be a huge problem for this little boy, she reported it to the physician and to her manager immediately. They called the cardiologist. The boy ended up being fine. He just needed to stay on monitoring longer than they had initially anticipated, and eventually he went out to the floor. So at the end of the day, the nurse is sitting with her manager, and she's pretty tearful and horrified by the mistake she's made that could have harmed this very adorable little boy. And the manager knows this nurse's work ethic, and she knows that this person always pays attention to detail, but is also thinking about the fact that we just threw this nurse into an ICU when she's only been out of school a few months, right? And not familiar with the ICU medication dispensing and so on and so forth. And she said, "Why did you report this? Weren't you afraid to report it?" And the nurse says, "Well, I could have been fired either way. What I was worried about is something bad happening to the boy. So the best thing to do was to report it, whether or not I get fired." And the manager said, "Well, I already have identified several system issues based on what we just talked about, and we'll be getting to work on those." And in her head and in her discussion with the staff person, she used a just culture algorithm. That nurse was me. And it was one of the most terrifying days of my life, years back when I just started out of nursing. But the circumstances are just as relevant today as they were back then. These kinds of system issues can still impact people and the way they perform the care. If you put them into stressful situations and expect them to make perfect decisions every time, without supporting them and enabling them and empowering them, you're going to continue to have, hopefully, just close calls and not real harm events. By the way, the reason I keep using the term close call as opposed to near miss to me suggests some kind of success. It sounds like, oh, we succeeded in avoiding harm. No, you almost succeeded in hurting a patient. And so close call to me gives it a different, if you will, gravitas. You know, it makes people think about it differently. So James Reason, again, obviously I love the guy. He has said that the most detrimental error is the failure to learn from an error. So when that person gave the wrong medication, or when a step was skipped in a process because all the other staff always skip that step, what can you learn from that? What can you do with it? First of all, you can aggregate. The most common day or shift for a close call or event type. Who in this room knows on which day of the week most of your patients fall? That is more hands than I usually get. I am impressed. What day?
This current month is Sunday.
On Sundays. How about over here? Wednesdays. And you're digging into that.
Yeah, so Sundays at 7 a to 7 p.
7 a to 7 p. Days on Sundays. Interesting. A lot of people say Friday nights end up being a popular day for events to happen. But if you don't know that simple information, if you're not aggregating your data like that, get at it when you get back home. The error-proof, or error-prone rather, situations in your organization can be identified through that. Most places, the number one error or mistake category is around medication management. Do you know why that is? It is so complicated. On average, there's 30 steps from the time of ordering to the time of administration. If you get those steps right 90% of the time, you still end up with thousands of errors. It's so complicated. So if you identify how the issue was successfully prevented from harming somebody, you build that into your prevention system. Every time a near miss or a close call happened with a medication, what stopped it? It takes a little bit of work, but if your system can aggregate your data for you, it's a really powerful way to get proactive. What do you want to do with that information once you find it out? You want to broadcast it as widely as you can. Publish it, put it on units, put it on the homepage of the intranet site. put it up on a banner in the hallways. Put it this way. I think it's literally impossible for you to over-communicate what you're doing with close call and incident event information. I think that trying to over-communicate it is the only way you're going to get it to people so that they feel comfortable in strong reporting. So we talked about leadership engagement at the beginning, and sometimes what we see is that leaders may know about a concern, but they discount its severity because harm didn't occur. Every single incident that occurs, every single harm incident that occurs, was probably preceded by multiple, if not hundreds of incidences of it as a close call. There is no event that happens without a bunch of close calls similar to it that have already occurred. So if you're not using that information to learn, it's gonna end up in an event down the road. Guaranteed. This is what we know from high reliability science. We also know, because there's been an increase in recommendations for improvement in the area of leadership during surveys, and it confirms this fact. So what you want the leadership teams to be doing is role modeling admission of mistakes and errors. Have your senior leadership team say, I had a great plan, but I executed it wrong. I made a mistake. I executed the wrong plan beautifully. Have them own up to saying, when they have made a mistake or an error, or there's a problem in their day that they hadn't previously considered an unintended consequence. And have them listen to discussions of concerns on rounds and during daily huddles. How many folks in the room are doing daily safety huddles? It's getting more and more prevalent out there. If you have a daily safety huddle where you have the same people saying at each and every instance, nothing to report, start over, because they are missing the things that you want to hear about. Or you are having a perfect day, really? We want to come see what a perfect day looks like. What is going absolutely right in your part of the organization, and how can we learn from it? Just start really getting people thinking about it. One of the daily safety huddles that I was lucky to listen to at Cincinnati Children's, because they allow anybody to call in for their daily safety huddles and listen to them after you sign a release. When they got to the materials management person, he said, there is a national shortage of 1cc syringes and of biotine, which is a cleaner used to prevent ventilators pneumonias. That's a problem in a pediatric facility to not have 1cc syringes, as well as the biotine. He said, so if we see a bump in back then the term was still ventilator-associated pneumonia, or VAP. If we see a bump in our VAPs in a month, this is gonna be why, and here's our plan for the 1cc syringes. That's the depth of the thinking that you want people to have. Not only report what the issue is, but report what you're planning to do about it. So time for your to-do list. So first of all, Sentinel event alerts number 57 and 60, and I believe we have 60 out on the Joint Commission table out there, both of which are free off of the jointcommission.org website. Talk about how to implement a strong safety culture in terms of both a learning organization and a reporting organization, and the 11 tenets of a safety culture, and I know for a fact that infographic is over there. Start with that. You also want to have leadership communicate their commitment to building trust and reporting. Within Sentinel Event Alert 60, there are links to videos that show that, and I've also got one on my resource slide. You want to develop a system that encourages reporting. Make it easy to use. If people say it takes too much time, figure out a way to make it take less time. Most vendors are willing to work with you to eliminate mandatory fields. If you have people that say, can't we just have a hotline, and you don't want to spend all the time transcribing stuff on the hotline, do it anyway. You need to make it as easy as possible for people to report. Has to be accessible to all staff. Even the physicians that aren't employed by your organization should have an easy way to get in there and do it. Is it going to enable you to do quick data analysis? If it's not, it might be time to talk to the vendor about upgrades or consider a different system. And then finally, defining what should be reported and using that data and communicating it perpetually to all of the staff. But wait, there's more. You want to hold leaders and staff, where appropriate, accountable for addressing and eliminating errors. So you want to recognize those reporters. You want to have some kind of monthly award ceremony or unit-based ceremony about which unit had the most reports that month. I worked with this hospital a while back that did that. They recognized by unit, not by person, because they wanted to get some, peer-to-peer competition going. And the award for the unit with the most reports that month was this giant, ugly softball trophy from somebody's basement. It was so big, they had to move it around on a cart. But people wanted that trophy, man, and they were reporting their brains out. And it was just the most successful thing that they'd ever seen from this junky old trophy. Communicate safety improvement stories. How did these reports lead to you getting better? Hey, do you know this unit reported to us about never being able to find IV pumps? And lo and behold, we found a bunch of them, we don't want to use the word hoarded, but perhaps stored in a different location than we would have wanted them to be. So communicate to them what it is that happened, and then say, tell me, what is the biggest annoyance in your day-to-day? What was the best thing that happened in your shift today, and what was the biggest annoyance? So that will help you address burnout and also help the people recognize the joys of their day. And if you do use a standardized accountability process, a just culture algorithm, if you will, make sure that the leaders at all levels are applying it consistently. You want to have routine training, not just one and done. You want to revisit this with the managers all the time. And you want to have an open door policy with the people that are in charge of that education so they could bring a problematic one in immediately so that they can have the conversation with the person that it needs to be used with. I have seen it be most successful when the staff person who is the subject of its use is involved in its use. Just perfect transparency. And measure its application. Do the great example we got earlier where if you have a bunch of managers in a room doing perhaps nursing grand rounds and you have a couple of these incidences, don't tell them the answer. Have them all run it through the algorithm and find out if there's variation, and if there is, why there's variation. So the 4 E's, to sum up, are establishing trust, encouraging reporting, get rid of the fear of punishment, and make sure you're looking at errors and close calls and hazardous conditions. So here's references and resources. Our folks do already have access to slides electronically. Is that going to be provided? They will be provided. Okay, so all of these 4 things on this page are clickable links, and they will be even in a PDF. So that's Sentinel Event Alert number 60, Developing a Reporting Culture, the 4 E's infographic, the Leadership Testament in that video on the bottom right, and that article I talked about, the abstract rather, on guidelines for action following patient safety incidents. I think I have 5 minutes. Any questions? I know, you're just thinking about lunch. Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy your lunch today.
Lunch in the ballroom.
Lunch is in the ballroom.
Yep.